So thank you very much for all of the effort that you've gone to. It's much appreciated. Right, could we have the coastal hazards team up to the table?
I'm not sure. I've proposed a couple of amendments to the resolution that was published, so I'm not sure whether we need a formal movement of that, or you're just prepared to accept them in the report as it is now.
Well, somebody's written affected communities when they meant to write affected communities. That would be, yeah. I'm a bit of a sort of grammar queen, I'm afraid. But okay, so I think that why don't we have questions of staff, and then we'll come to the resolution. But I can't see any harm. Are you happy with the wording?
Yes.
That we had a slight adjustment of.
Well, look, I think in the deputation we've just heard there was a desire to... Is this on?
Yeah.
A desire to engage with the affected communities in terms of selection of the peer review panel. And that's my intention in B. And ultimately in C, the result of the peer review needs to be reflected in the LIM notations. If the peer review comes back and severely criticises aspects of the report, that should be reflected in what goes on the LIMs as well. So I just want to make that connection between the peer review and the LIM reports ultimately. Yeah,
and also, but we would retain 3, which also requires an immediate review of the LIM notation. Yeah. Yep. So yeah. I think that just in terms of a little bit of background, ever since the government agreed that they would take this item off the agenda, and I think it's interesting some of the comments that have been made, that the process I think that we were under dictated timeframes that we couldn't possibly manage, and that what really got lost in the whole process was the time available for community engagement before notification. So there's no question that people have worked hard on community engagement post-notification, but at that stage people felt that there was nothing that they could do about what was going to be publicly notified in the process, and then off to an independent hearings panel, which I think a lot of people quite justifiably felt they weren't going to be able to get the level of scientific advice in order to challenge the Tonkin and Taylor report, or to challenge the notification that we had made. And the independent hearings panel process has been very legalistic. I think a lot more legalistic than people had anticipated from the outset. It certainly wasn't that way in Littleton with the Littleton recovery plan, and that went through an independent hearings panel process, which has been quite different. The Auckland process has been quite different. So I think what we've ended up with has been really a combination of almost an appellate jurisdiction at the front end of a hearings process, and that has been extremely difficult for people, and it's been one of the drivers why the council wanted to take this away from the independent hearings panel process and take a full year of public engagement before we even start a process that will lead to a notification under the RMA. We're hoping that in that time frame, central government will catch up, and that they will provide all of the councils in New Zealand that have coastlines with the technical advice and support that we need, and we all need it. It's not just Christchurch, it's, as exactly as has been said. It's not just Auckland, it's not just Dunedin, it's not just Invercargill, it's everywhere that has coastal hazards, because the way the coastline interacts with the sea depends on a whole lot of factors. So we need advice, centrally provided advice and guidance. And then we have to look at our own coastline and determine how that advice operates here. And I think that, I don't think anyone really thought ahead of putting the entire district plan through this fast-track process, which is in the interests of the city in so many ways because we're recovering from an earthquake, but in this particular issue it hasn't been a very good process at all. So after the government agreed to take this out of the process, I knew that the problem wasn't going to be resolved unless we addressed the question of limbs. And it was at that point that I realised that there was no point addressing the limbs if you didn't address the Building Act. And I think what this has done is it has brought to everyone's attention that the Building Act provisions that require the land vulnerability to natural hazards to be taken into account is in the wrong piece of legislation. It shouldn't be in the Building Act, it should be in the RMA. That's where the land protection provisions should exist. It's where the existing use rights provisions exist, and the two of them should be together. So it seems to me that we now have probably inappropriate to use the phrase perfect storm, but we do have a perfect storm in that we have a resource legislation amendment bill before Parliament right now, and I'm speaking to people in the back of the room as well, and I hope they're taking notes about making a submission on it, because to transfer the Building Act requirements into the resource legislation amendment bill I think is very doable. And the reason why I think it's very doable is that the Minister for Building and Construction is the Minister for the Environment. Perfect storm. We have the same Minister who understands completely that the Building Act provision is in the wrong piece of legislation, and we have an immediate opportunity where we can see that change occur. Our own building consent staff have been meeting with MB to pursue this, and had a meeting as late as Monday, which is why this paper was late being requested and on the agenda today. So we've had different streams of work going on within the council in order to bring us to this position, and you know, it's kind of ideal really that we've been able to get this on the agenda today. So I think the councillors did have a couple of questions that they just wanted to raise, and David, I wanted to start with you because you had a question that you wanted to put to staff on one of the aspects, although you may in fact have now had that resolved by the amendment. And Tim, you had a...
I was just wanting to talk to, just to clarify, but we can do that later if you can ask.
Yep. So has anyone got any questions for staff? Glenn?
Yes, please. Yes. Thank you. I have two questions. The first is in relation to the current status of the Tonkin and Taylor report. So given that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment has now put some distance between her report and the TNT report, what is the status of that report? And given also that it's going to be now, well, I won't second guess the council, but I suspect the council will agree to it being peer reviewed. I think its credibility is under question. So how does that now hold up in terms of LIM? And given that really the chapter and the LIM were kind of, in my view, truck and trailer. So if you take one out, surely the other has to go as well.
The Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment's report in this section looking at Christchurch, and there's two or three sections actually that look at Christchurch, has not reviewed the Tonkin and Taylor report as such. What she's looked at is how we've used the information in the Tonkin and Taylor report to inform the comments on the LIM in particular, and she's cast some she has some concerns about the way that information is expressed, that it's not clear enough, and that in terms of the inundation information, because it's so succinct, it could be seen to imply that the risk is higher than it actually is for a particular property. So we need to clarify those comments and how we've expressed the base information in the report. But the base information in the report itself remains valid, and that has been peer reviewed.
I just had one more. Just over the actual tendering process, our procurement policy asks that we obviously have an open, transparent process over contracts. So could you please explain how Tonkin and Taylor were awarded the contract?
Well, Tonkin and Taylor are well known and are very well qualified consultants in terms of the coastal hazards work, and they've done coastal hazards work for a number of councils right around New Zealand. The reason that they were appointed to do the 2013 report and the 2015 report was that they had already done a coastal hazards assessment for Christchurch back in 1999, and we needed those reports very quickly to provide information for the district plan review. So there was a very tight time frame, and they were able to do that work in the time frame available.
So if we'd had a proper time frame and we weren't under the pressure of the district plan review, it would have gone to an open tender.
Yes, it may or may not have gone to an open tender, and Tonkin and Taylor may or may not have got that work.
But that was the only reason for going straight to them, was the time frame we were under and the fact that they'd already done an assessment back in 1999.
And we considered them to be capable of doing the work.
Although the OAG guidelines still call us to play by the rules, so to still seek
but
other
you've
contracts.
asked a question. The answer is it was really to do with the time frame. Yeah, and the OAG guidelines are guidelines. Anyway, Raf, and then you're not Raf, you are Yanni, and then Phil.
They look so similar.
They look the same, you know.
They think the same.
I just had a question probably similar to Tim's around B, because consultation with affected communities I think is too broad, and I mean we had a very specific request. We had a number of recommendations that the deputation made, so I just wanted to hear a kind of staff response to some of those points of concern. So, and then I wanted to be more explicit around B, whether we could actually specify the coastal residents group, because it seems to me the affected communities are very broad. I mean, you've got people in Linwood and Woolston that are affected, and I don't quite know how you'd give effect to working out who you actually engage with. And given that we already had a process to engage, and for whatever reason that hasn't been very successful, is it that we need to be more explicit? So there's a direct question on B, and then a question around particular concerns that were expressed around the criticism of the Tonkin and Taylor report, what the staff response to that is.
Yeah, I don't know that staff can answer that question. I mean, it's deliberately broad because there are a number of communities who are affected by the coastal area. I think, as I've mentioned before, when we were in Akaroa want us to be providing them with some good quality information in this area.
Could we change the word
sorry,
could to be would?
This is just
Could we
selecting.
change the word could to be would?
Oh, sorry.
This is just selecting the
The
panel
details
that
of
does the
which
peer review.
will be determined after consultation with affected communities. It's deliberately left loose. It's just not a requirement to do everyone. It's a requirement to consider who's affected. So it is deliberately broad, but it's not about. It's just not about preferring one group over another. It's just about recognising that there's a range of people who've been affected by this, and it's a discussion. It's a consultation about it. It's not.
Sorry, let me just be really clear. So my understanding of 2B is that that's the choice about who we use to do the peer review.
Well,
So-
no, it may not be just about who does the peer review.
peer
It might
review
be
done by
some
an outside
elements
to be
of the
experts.
specific terms of reference for the peer review. So I just think that it's deliberately broad, just to enable people to have a genuine consultation. I mean, like one of the comments that I read recently was that people didn't want NIWA officials, for example, and they're the technical advisors on sea level rise to the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, but they're also the technical advisors to the Ministry for the Environment. Well, why wouldn't you want to have a consideration of at least having someone from the technical advisors to the government who are going to be providing nationwide guidelines?
Yeah, I'm not debating who we.
Yeah, but that's why I don't want
just
to have the debate here. I want to have an open discussion and allow our staff to work with affected communities. It can be broad. There's no reason to prefer one group over another, because if you list one and leave out another, then they're going to feel aggrieved. I'd much rather leave it up to a more open process.
Can I just get a time frame for how that consultation will be done and when we'll be in a position to identify who will be doing that work?
Sorry, what was that again?
Can I just get a time frame for B?
Yeah.
In terms of when we would make a decision on who would do that review?
Well, I think with your leave, I would quite like to an urgent peer review perhaps be conducted. I certainly don't want to see this linger for 6 months, 12 months or whatever.
None of us do.
So my intention in that amendment was to get the peer review done in a manner that was acceptable to the affected communities, and that peer review be conducted as quickly as possible. Perhaps that part of it's not reflected in the amendment at the moment. Maybe a peer review be conducted as soon as possible.
Yep, as soon as possible.
And then the response to the concerns that were raised about the TNT report.
I think that's, if I may, Madam Mayor, that's an issue for the peer review. It's not for staff to debate that here and now.
Yep. Phil and then Tim.
Thank you for the report, Helen. Can I just ask you around the frequency of flooding and I'm referring to part 5.5 and 5.6 in your report, and perhaps if you can explain to us the meaning of, for example, a flood in a 100-year event or one in a 50-year event, and then the levels that might be expected to arise.
One of the issues that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment report addressed was the change in the frequency of serious flooding events as a result of climate change and sea level rise, and that's not something that we have explicitly addressed either in the Tonkin and Taylor report or in the LIM comments, and that does lead to some misunderstanding because the scale of these events and the frequency of these events will change over time. And one of the examples that Dr. Wright gives in her report is modelling of the frequency of today's 100-year event. So if you were at a picnic table in Akaroa on the shoreline, and at this picnic table, if today's 100-year event came up to the level of that picnic table, that is probably okay for a picnic table on a reserve in Akaroa. But what the technical information is telling us that with 30 centimetres of sea level rise, you'd expect a storm event that would reach that picnic table to be happening every year. So not every 100 years, but every year you'd be getting flooding up to the top of this picnic table. And with 1 metre of sea level rise, it would be happening on every tide. So that gives an indication of how the scale of storm event flooding is reaching further and further inland with the rising sea levels.
Thanks, Helen. My other question is, perhaps could you just, like the reports being criticised around using the Brunn method approach, could you perhaps also tell us about, explain to us about the other methods of that are contained in the report, and I'm referring, I guess, to the LIDAR information and how, in fact, that worked.
You're getting into some technical detail here that I'm not confident to explain without some notes, unfortunately.
I'm sorry about
there is some. There are a couple of things there, though. The Brunn rule is one of the matters that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment in her report mentions in terms of the uncertainty the degree of uncertainty that brings into the assessment of sea level rise and then resulting coastal erosion, particularly on open coasts. So the Brun Wall has been used for the open coast work, but it is not used for the enclosed estuaries. So where the coastal erosion zones are mapped, for example, along the New Brighton Spit, the Brun Wall rule is used to determine the coastal erosion zones on the open coast side, but it is not used to determine the coastal erosion zones on the estuary side. There's two other techniques that are used to model and determine where the zones fit.
Okay, look, that's fine. Thank you.
Yeah. Tim?
Just to clarify, excuse me, just to clarify B, when you're reviewing a technical document, it must be based, peer review will be based on scientific fact. But what I'm reading in B, and Dave, correct me if I'm wrong, just to clarify, but there are, and I went out with Tim to see his area, etc. So apart from the peer review being based on scientific fact, which you would hope it would be, there would be, with consultation with interest groups, whether they be on the coast or Lower Heathcote, Avon or the estuary, etc., that there would be a lens put over those particular areas of concern for those communities. Is that what we're kind of looking at? Because I would see that would be the logical way to go. I'll take that as a yes.
Oh, yeah, yes.
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
All right. Okay, well, David, you'd like to move this?
If I could just make one comment in terms of the peer review being conducted as soon as possible. I understand this is a matter of urgency, but I would not like to see this suffer the same fate as some of the work under the district plan in terms of being fast-tracked at the expense of quality.
Yeah.
So I'm quite happy to take on board urgency, but I do want to be sure that we have the right people available, and it may be that we identify a panel and then people are not available and we need to do some more work to identify others, rather than sell ourselves short on that.
Shall we put as soon as practicable rather than as soon as possible?
Yeah, I'd be perfectly happy with that.
Then it indicates the sense of urgency. But I mean, I agree. We don't want to come back here and be having another argument about whether the peer review of the peer review of the peer review was
exactly. We want to do this well. We want to do it well.
Yeah, we do. All right. So that's moved by David and seconded by Glenn. So right, is there any discussion? Yanni.
Thank you for this report. I think it is really important that we do acknowledge the concern that has been expressed, and we do need to take action and